Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today, we're diving into an exciting new prediction for the 2024 presidential election based on the most recent polling data. This is where we break down the latest numbers, state by state, to see how the electoral map is shaping up for Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Now, let's jump straight into it. Who's winning which states? We're going to start by filling in the solid states, those where either Harris or Trump hold a commanding lead of more than 15 points. These states are effectively locked in for their respective candidates. For Kamala Harris, we're seeing very predictable Democratic strongholds. California, Washington, Hawaii, and Oregon are all safely in her column, with leads upwards of 20 points, according to Real Clear Politics. On the East Coast, it's much of the same story. New York, Vermont, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Delaware, Maryland, and the District of Columbia are all firmly blue, as they have been in many past elections. Realistically, these states are pretty much locked down for Harris. On the other side, Donald Trump also has his share of rock-solid states. The deep red heartland comes through for him once again, with Idaho, Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota, and most of Nebraska showing massive double-digit leads for Trump. Utah, Oklahoma, and the southern states of Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia are also considered locked in for Trump. These states have been voting Republican for years, and 2024 doesn't look any different. So with those solid states filled in, here's where we stand. Now that the solid states are marked, let's talk about the likely states. These are states where one candidate is expected to win, but the margin is closer, typically between 7 to 15 points. For Harris, the likely states include Colorado, Illinois, New Jersey, Nebraska's 2nd Congressional District, and Maine's 1st Congressional District. These states lean Democratic but remain slightly competitive. Colorado, for example, has leaned increasingly blue in recent elections, especially as its suburban areas grow and diversify. But it still has some Republican-leaning rural regions that make it a bit more competitive. Similarly, Illinois is solidly Democratic, thanks in large part to Chicago, though rural parts of the state still show some Republican support. On Trump's side, the likely Republican states include Alaska, Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, Montana, and South Carolina. These states have traditionally leaned Republican, but recent trends show they may not be quite as secure as the deep red states we just covered. For example, Iowa was solid for Trump in the last 2 elections, but polling this year shows the margin tightening. Trump leads by about 7 points, but it's a sign that Democrats are gaining ground in key areas. Similarly, Missouri and South Carolina are leaning Republican, but changing demographics and increased Democratic efforts are making these states slightly more competitive. Let's move to the next category, the lean states. These are more competitive, with polling showing the leading candidate ahead by 3 to 6 points. For Harris, Maine, New Hampshire, New Mexico, Minnesota, and Virginia are in this category. While these states are currently leaning Democratic, they aren't out of reach for Republicans. In Maine and New Hampshire, Harris is benefiting from a progressive voter base, but there's still a level of competitiveness, especially in Maine's rural areas. New Mexico, with its large Hispanic population, leans toward Harris as well, but Republicans are making efforts to close the gap. Virginia has leaned blue in recent presidential elections, but recent Republican gains in statewide races show it's still competitive. Harris leads by a slim margin of 3% to 5%. With her focus on suburban voters and key issues like abortion rights and education helping her secure support in key areas. Minnesota is another important lean state for Harris, where she holds a roughly 4.7% lead. Minnesota has voted Democratic in every presidential election since 1976, but Trump remains competitive in rural areas. Harris's running mate Tim Walz, the popular governor of Minnesota, could also help solidify support here. For Trump, the lean states include Florida, Ohio, Texas, and Maine's 2nd Congressional District. Let's start with Florida, where Trump has a narrow lead. polling about 3% to 6% ahead of Harris. Florida has shifted more Republican in recent years, but it's still competitive, especially given its history as a swing state. Texas is another interesting state to watch. Trump leads by 7% to 8%, but growing Democratic support in suburban areas has made it more competitive than it's been in the past. Ohio, once considered a bellwether state, also leans Trump, but by a smaller margin than in previous elections, suggesting a closer race than many might have expected. Now, let's dive into the real nail-biters, the toss-up states. These are the battlegrounds that could go either way and will ultimately decide who wins the presidency. The polling margins here are razor-thin, typically within 2%. The key toss-up states this year are Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. In Arizona, Trump currently holds a slight lead of 1.7%. This is a crucial battleground that flipped blue in 2020 for the first time since 1996. Changing demographics, including a growing Latino population, offer Harris a chance to close the gap, but for now, Trump holds a narrow edge. Similarly, Nevada is another state to watch, with Harris leading by just 1.1%. Nevada's Latino voters and strong union presence in cities like Las Vegas give her a slight advantage, but it's anyone's game. Georgia remains a key battleground, with Trump leading by 1.5%. After Biden flipped the state in 2020, Harris is working hard to maintain that momentum, especially by focusing on voter turnout in suburban areas and among Black voters. North Carolina is just as close, with Trump leading by less than 1%. It's a state that's grown more competitive in recent years, and Harris is focusing on energizing younger voters in cities like Raleigh and Charlotte. Wisconsin and Michigan are both crucial Rust Belt states, where Harris holds slight leads, 0.8% in Wisconsin and 0.7% in Michigan. These states flipped back to Democrats in 2020, and Harris is working to build on that success by focusing on urban and suburban voters, particularly in places like Milwaukee and Detroit. Finally, Pennsylvania is shaping up to be a true battleground, with the race essentially tied. Some polling averages give Harris a slight edge of 0.8%, but this state remains very much in play for both candidates. Pennsylvania, with its mix of urban Democratic strongholds and rural Republican regions, could be the tipping point in the 2024 election. So, after breaking down the map, where does this leave us? As of now, with all the likely, lean, and toss-up states accounted for, Kamala Harris stands at 276 electoral votes, securing a narrow victory. But, as we all know, anything can change between now and Election Day, especially in these highly competitive battlegrounds. Take a moment to let us know in the comments which party you're backing, Republicans or Democrats. We're excited to see which side our viewers are supporting more. Thanks so much for tuning in today. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and stay with me for all the latest updates as we get closer to November. The race is heating up and there's a lot more to come.